I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after a historic weekend, as US and Ukrainian delegations met in Geneva to discuss the US-Russian peace proposals, we assess Europe's response as it scrambles to form a collective position, before asking just how severe the ramifications would be if, as President Trump has threatened, he cuts off military and intelligence support to Kyiv. Then we hear the latest updates on the front line and give an update on the other major story of the moment, the corruption scandal threatening the stability of President Zelensky's government at this vital moment of the war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody is going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 24th of November, 3 years and 275 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor for Defence, Dominic Nicholls. And later, the Kyiv Independent's Jakub Parusinski. But first, the major updates from the weekend and this morning. You join us for what could be one of the most vital weeks of diplomacy since World War II. Let's pick up where we left you on Friday, when more details of the US-Russian so-called peace plan were leaked to the Telegraph and others, revealing demands that, if signed, Kyiv would have to cut its army in half and cede full legal ownership of Donetsk and Luhansk, areas Moscow does not fully control, along with Crimea. In return, Russia would see Western sanctions lifted, regain G7 membership, and recover most of its frozen assets. Addressing the nation after our broadcast, President Zelensky, speaking for 10 minutes, said Ukraine faced a very difficult choice, either losing dignity or risk losing a key partner, adding, "Today is one of the most difficult moments in our history." Shortly afterwards, US Vice President J.D. Vance posted the following. Any Ukraine-Russia peace plan has to 1. Stop the killing while preserving Ukrainian sovereignty. 2. Be acceptable to both Russia and Ukraine. 3. Maximise the chances war doesn't restart. Every criticism of the peace framework the administration is working on either misunderstands the framework or misstates some critical reality on the ground. There is a fantasy that if we just give more money, more weapons or more sanctions, victory is at hand. Peace won't be made by failed diplomats or politicians living in a fantasy land. It might be made by smart people living in the real world. Now, Europe was clearly caught off guard, though why, given months of warnings about such a scenario, remains baffling. Politicians and experts, both publicly and privately, were dismayed by this proposal, not least because transliteration slips, bureaucratic phrasing, and certain terminology seems to leave little doubt the 28-point document had been translated from Russian, confirming that the plan originated in Moscow. Christo Grozev, investigative journalist for Der Spiegel and The Insider, said he saw an early version of what then was a 30-point plan 6 months ago, when it was a purely Russian concept, his words, and was nearly identical to what we see today. The two items missing are a proposal that US investors bail post-war Russia out of a recession, something designed to induce Trump, and a new Russia-US alliance against China, featuring references to a Christian alliance. But the bigger concerns in European capitals relate to the risks for their own security if such a plan were ever signed. Further, in the words of the ex-head of Estonian intelligence, if the US is enforcing this plan, it would place itself in violation of at least 13 binding treaties and international instruments, 23 political commitments, declarations and authoritative resolutions, 35 explicit articles, clauses and legal principles. Critics also stress not only the plan's fundamental unjustness, but also Putin's record of violating agreements. Budapest, Minsk I and II, every ceasefire since 2014, using frozen conflicts to rearm and wage hybrid war. They also argued that any US security guarantee would lack credibility in light of President Trump's statements. Mitch McConnell, the former Senate Republican leader, accused Trump of appeasement, rewarding Russian butchery, saying it would be disastrous to America's interests. A capitulation like Biden's abandonment of Afghanistan would be catastrophic to a legacy of peace through strength. Yet it's important to register that not everyone was as scathing. Professor Mark Galeotti wrote, "While the text of the US plan for Ukraine is poorly drafted and incomplete, it is not a simple call for Ukrainian capitulation. As a starting point for something that could stop the killing, it has some promise. By sticking to acknowledging Russia's de facto control of the occupied territories, it sidesteps the need for a Ukrainian constitutional referendum or even EU formal acceptance. This doesn't preclude some peaceful future reunification, Germany style. Capping the Ukrainian army to 600,000 isn't as draconian as I imagine the Russians wanted. When I talked to some British MOD analysts a couple of months back, they expressed doubts Kyiv could afford more than 500,000 long term." Now that brings us to Saturday, as European leaders scrambled to forge a united position. British Prime Minister Starmer said Kyiv's allies sought to strengthen the plan at their meeting at the G20 summit in South Africa. French President Macron and German Chancellor Merz also criticised elements of the proposal, confirming the handover of the two eastern provinces and the demilitarisation of Ukraine are not acceptable to Europe. Merz said he'd spoken to Trump and told him the entire European continent was at stake in the negotiations, while Donald Tusk, Poland's PM, said Russia cannot impose its conditions on the continent. Some found hope in a remark from Trump that the plan was not his final offer, but remained anxious of his Thursday deadline for Kyiv to accept or face a withdrawal of US military and intelligence support. More on that later. Putin used this moment to break his silence, saying Ukraine and its European allies were still dreaming of defeating Russia on the battlefield, but that if Kyiv does not want to discuss Trump's proposals and refuses to do so, then both it and the European warmongers must understand that the events that took place in Kupiansk will inevitably be repeated in other key sectors of the front. And so to Sunday, when a US delegation, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, flew to Geneva, Switzerland, to meet with Kyiv's delegation, led by Andriy Yermak. Rubio, it's reported, was also blindsided by the Witkoff plan, something seemingly confirmed but since denied by Rubio in a conversation he had with senior Republicans, when one of them afterwards said that the plan is not our recommendation, it is not our peace plan. Europe chose this moment to release its own peace proposal. Perhaps speaking to the chaos of this moment in time, there are at least two versions circulating which use the US-Russia plan as a basis. But it differs in these key areas. Point 3 of the US proposal, which said there will be the expectation that Russia will not invade its neighbours and NATO will not expand further, has been removed. It also places a military cap on the Ukrainian military at 800,000 in peacetime and says Ukraine joining NATO depends on the consensus of NATO members, which does not exist, and says, quote, NATO agrees not to permanently station troops under its command in Ukraine in peacetime. Though the wording there says nothing about Western forces beyond NATO's remit being potentially deployed. It then pushes for a US guarantee that mirrors Article 5. Its major concession, if that's the right word, is that it retains the reintegration of Moscow into the global economy. However, after his emergency summit with Kyiv's representatives, Rubio said he knew nothing of this European counter-plan, saying the US was now making some changes to its own. He also said it was probably the best meeting and day we've had so far in this entire process, going back to when we first came to office in January. A joint statement with the Kyiv government said, quote, the talks were constructive, focused and respectful, underscoring the shared commitment to achieving a just and lasting peace, fully upholding Ukraine's sovereignty. Behind the scenes, however, sources suggest the meeting was understandably tense, with the Americans accusing the Ukrainians of leaking negative details about the plan in the US media. The Ukrainians agreed, therefore, to issue a positive statement in order to clear the air. They also presented a counterplan, though whether it's the same as the Europeans remains unclear. Friend of the podcast, Christopher Miller of the Financial Times, summarises the mood as follows. What I'm hearing from President Zelensky's team is that negotiations have been tough, but they feel they are making actual progress in the talks with the Americans. As for Zelensky going to Washington, this has been something being considered in the president's office since last week, when this new Trump push began. There are two camps, one that thinks Zelensky needs to go to DC to hash this out with Trump in person, another that fears it could go awry, like past meetings, and lead to a serious setback. The breaking news within the past hour is that Finland's Alexander Stubb and Italy's Giorgia Meloni have departed for the US, two leaders who Trump likes and presumably Europe is deploying as a weapon of sorts. Meanwhile, the Coalition of the Willing will be meeting again later for what could be the most important discussion it's had since its inception. So lots more for us to talk about on this pivotal day. But first, Dom, what are your reflections on all that?
Well, thanks, Francis. Hello, everyone. Quiet weekend? Yeah, I've got a few reflections. I will start, if I may, with a post on Twitter by Bill Browder, chairman of the Global Magnitsky campaign. He makes an interesting point. He says, it seems clear to me that the 28-point peace plan, that Russian-heavy peace plan, was just a Russian wish list, fantasy football, he says. There was never any chance of it being agreed to. But what is getting lost in all the noise is that since the leaking of this Russian wish list, it has created so much controversy that everyone has forgotten about the US sanctions on the main buyers of Russian oil. There was legislation that was teed up and ready to go. If the US had followed through on that, Russia would be out of business in 6 months because they rely on that oil revenue to fund their war. In my view, that's as in Bill Browder's view, this whole peace plan kerfuffle is just about that. And has anyone heard another word about those oil sanctions? No. Well played, Putin. He can now carry on and relax that his main economic lifeline is still in place. Interesting point. Yeah, don't forget that's in the background. Don't forget the corruption scandal is still in the background. But what did I think going over the weekend? Well, that 28-point plan, we spoke about some of the specific points on Thursday, Friday, but just taking a step back, the big things that leapt out for me, number one, it denied Ukraine agency. It was just talking over the head of Ukraine as if it didn't matter. This is a classic Russian talking point. It sought at every juncture to cut off Ukraine from international support and also sought to influence NATO directly, talking about basing of aircraft and all the rest of it. It's not for Russia to tell NATO what it can and can't do. And it also sought to drive a wedge between the US and NATO. That whole thing about Russia would deal with NATO, with the US being the honest arbiter, blah, 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 blah. So while there were some areas of potential start points, happy to talk about that later, in no way should that deal have been considered a take it or leave it, which is how it was characterised by some Thursday, Friday, that kind of time. Now, over the weekend, I had a chat with a European ambassador on background, so I'm not going to say where he or she was from, but a significant European country, significant supporter of Ukraine. And the ambassador said to me that as well as all these quote-unquote smaller points of difference over land, reparations, frozen assets, the 28-point plan talking about denazification, which Ukraine, they wouldn't sign it and thereby accept that term had any relevance. The ambassador said there were three baskets of problems. Number one, it limited Ukraine's sovereignty, as we've talked about. But in particular, that idea of what organisations you can and can't join, that, the ambassador said, all post-Cold War European and indeed world security architectures are built around these kind of agreements about which organisations you join, the security relationships you have. So it's not for another country to say, you can't do that, etc., etc. The second thing the ambassador said was they pointed to the hollowness of the security guarantees, this idea of no foreign troops, which cuts out the coalition of the willing, this idea about not having any aircraft in Ukraine, specifically said only European aircraft could be based in Poland. So that at once wipes out the United States, again, directly impinging on NATO. And it also said, by pointing out Poland, that deliberately omits Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia. Now, that's where the Baltic Air Policing mission is based. So, again, this is Russia, on the one hand, suggesting it's giving something by saying we will allow European aircraft to be based in Poland. And then if that was signed up to, they'd say, well, of course, this means the Baltic Air Policing mission has to end. So there were poo traps all over this. That clause in particular said European fighter jets will be based in Poland. It specifically mentioned Europeans and Poland. And then the third thing that the ambassador said was that this was Russia trying to go back to the December 2021 ultimatum that Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister, put to foreign ministers at the time, which essentially was about rolling back NATO borders, no further NATO enlargement, etc., etc. So the ambassador said that there were two in particular issues with this. So points 2 and 4 of the 28-point plan. So point 2 said there'd be a comprehensive non-aggression agreement will be concluded between Russia, Ukraine and Europe. All ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered settled. The point being, it's only Russia that sees ambiguities in there. Only Russia that keeps going on about root causes of the war, etc., etc. That's not settling anything. That's unpicking everything. And then point 4 of the 28-point plan said a dialogue will be held between Russia and NATO, mediated by the United States, to resolve all security issues and create conditions for de-escalation in order to ensure global security and increase conditions for cooperation and future economic development. Well, as if the United States is not in NATO. And that is all about splitting NATO, splitting the United States away, imposing limits of Ukraine's sovereign ability to act, etc., etc. Now, the 24-point plan, of which there are various versions, as you said, it's a bit confusing what's coming out, but the European response to that thing last week. Firstly, guys, version control. I mean, blimey, use links, don't resave it and send another copy. But that, contrasting the Russian thing, or the Russian-heavy plan, because the US said they were intimately involved with it, that does affirm Ukrainian agency. It does still allow for external links. The G8 thing, allowing Russia back in, the G7 become the G8 again, fine. I mean, if you look at the point, it's hedged in all sorts of language about at the appropriate time, when other commitments are adhered to, etc., etc., etc. So, there's lots attached to that. Don't worry about the G8. That's something to trade on. That is a good thing. The 600,000 limit on the army, again, don't worry about this. I'm kind of with Mark Galeotti on this, and there's not a lot of chat about it, but any conversation I've seen says that Ukraine will only be able to afford about 500,000 in the army because the demand for personnel, resources, money to rebuild the country. And also, you can play tunes on that. When you say in the army, do you mean soldiers with guns? What about paramilitary units? What about special police? What about normal? Do you mean anybody who's got an automatic rifle or a crew-served weapon like mortars or tanks, something like that? So that's definitely the army. Where do you draw the line?
And
basically?
Reservists.
And absolutely. And reservists. So where do you draw the line? So don't worry about these things. If Russia wants to have a debate and Ukraine is happy to accept the thing about 600,000, fine. They'll trade that for something else. And the G8, fine. These are all tradable points. So just got to keep that in perspective. I mean, as I said on Thursday, I think this is time for Europe to do what it does best, to play to its strengths, to deploy the diplomatic fudge and kick that can down the road. You've just got to get through to Thursday, Thanksgiving, long weekend, public holiday in the United States. Donald Trump's attention will be somewhere else next week, and this will all just be, as with the sanctions, as with the Energoatom corruption scandal, we'll be going, do you remember last week when we were doing that? Oh, yeah, that 28, was it 28 or 38? I think this will just be diplomatic wallpaper, which we'll be referring to. There's a lot going on at the moment in the United States. Really interesting that Secretary of State Dan Driscoll was the guy who presented the plan. Who's he? Well, he's an old friend of J.D. Vance, vice president from Yale Law School. Vance and Rubio, apparently now at loggerheads, they're absolutely going for it, vying for the Republican ticket for 2028 election. Pete Hegseth seems to have dropped out of favour, hence Dan Driscoll's coming to the fore. So there's an awful lot going on here. Keith Kellogg's shifted to the right. So a lot of stuff happening in the US administration. It wouldn't take an awful lot for Trump's attention to go elsewhere. So there's a lot going on, but actually just keep your eyes on not an awful lot has changed. Europeans saw the E3, so Britain, France and Germany kind of got their act together over the weekend, spoke to the US and Ukraine in Geneva. You've now got this delegation going to the States, Giorgia Meloni and Alexander Stubb, Europe's best Trump whisperers. So things are moving, but there's not quite the white heat in this issue that there seemed to be a few days ago.
Thanks, Dom. Well, for me, there are two key known unknowns. The extent to which each side is sincere in what it's saying publicly versus playing the game, as you say, and what the ramifications would be if the US were to carry out its threat of withdrawing military and intelligence support from Kyiv. Is Europe in a position to fill the gap now or not, if it feels it has no choice but to reject these terms? Now, on the second question, there were reports late on Friday the US could pull out of the Pearl program, by which Europe buys US weapons and sends them to Ukraine, though this runs against other reports, such as one in the Wall Street Journal, that the US remains committed to providing at least intelligence support. Now, I tapped up a trusted expert whose opinion I really value on these matters, but who needs to keep their identity anonymous. They said this, quote, "If the US decides to reduce support, there are multiple outcomes with increasing dramatic implications. Today, the US is almost exclusively providing intelligence support with very minimal direct transfers of weapons. Intelligence is critical to battlefield fires like GMLRs and fiber optic drones that require precise, real-time targeting and understanding the movement of enemy forces. Loss of this can be alleviated with a combination of European personnel processing intelligence and more longer-range ISR drones. Europe as a whole lacks capacity, but pairing a country to one more Ukrainian corps could do much of this. Air defence is critical to stop ballistic missiles and to keep Russian bombers and heavy fighters from being over Ukrainian cities. Long-range rocket artillery is key to prevent Russian forces from massing ground logistics. As long as Pearl is available, Europe can source these from the US. Without Pearl, Europe can internationally source long-range rocket artillery from outside Europe. But Europe can barely produce and source limited quantities of missiles to keep the bombers and fighters at bay, so it has no option currently than to provide ballistic missile and long-range air defence in the form of the US Patriot. With political will to spend whatever it takes, ignore national laws and let operational testing be live firing in Ukraine, Europe could scale up production of its two viable systems. But in 18 months. There is a worst-case option. The US halts export of optics, energetics and other materials used to produce munitions. However, Europe does have a viable alternative to all of this. Ukraine's strike drones have been able to successfully hit Russian targets but lack the mass to make the needed impact. Europe could quickly ramp up production of strike drones and possibly Flamingo-style missiles. Then Ukraine would need to focus strikes on destroying Russia's supply chains, beginning with oil and ending at logistics depots. The goal should be 1,000 or more strike drones per day. So that is one assessment of the option facing Europe if it determines that the Russia-US plan has to be rejected for the continent's own security. Which brings us to the other question I raised a moment ago. Just how sincere is each side's stated position? Is Europe just seeking to kick the can down the proverbial road, getting past this deadline and avoiding the worst-case scenario? Or is it genuinely calculating it's better a bad deal now than a worst one in 6 months? From my conversations, Europe appears genuinely shaken and isn't yet ready to be thinking strategically. And if that is true, a tragic indictment of a failure to prepare for this entirely predictable scenario. And what of the Russians? It's interesting that in the Russian press, they seem to be sowing the seeds of scepticism. As the BBC's Steve Rosenberg highlights, one paper says the Ukrainian-European gang will correct Trump's plan so that it's unacceptable for Russia. And in another, I don't think the special military operation will end this year. Ultimately, this could really end like the minerals deal. Initial threats, ultimatums from President Trump demanding signature under warnings of immediate defeat, collapse, national ruin, followed, as negotiations continue, by a gradual dilution of the proposal until it becomes a non-binding memorandum with very little consequence. Or this could be the real deal, as Europe and Kyiv calculate they have no option but to seize this opportunity. But all the while, of course, the war continues. So, Dom, let's go to the regular military updates now. Where do you want to start?
Oh, thanks, Francis. Let's go to the Donbass. So the upshot is not a lot happened over the weekend. There's a lot in Russia's... they've put a lot of information out saying they've taken lots of territory, small villages and land. There's not an awful lot of evidence for that, but they're trying to bolster the narrative that of this inexorable grind west, that they are winning, that it's only an inevitable outcome. Unsurprising that all this messaging was happening over the weekend as stuff was happening in Geneva and elsewhere. But in the Donbass, Ukraine's 7th Rapid Reaction Corps of the air assault forces said yesterday that fighting is still ongoing in central Pokrovsk in the Donbass as Russia is trying to push into the northern areas. Russian mill bloggers say that Ukraine is counter-attacking there. As ever, it's very difficult to get anything like reliable information out of that kind of situation. Ukrainian Special Ops Forces said yesterday they had been conducting drone strikes against Russian forces in Pokrovsk. I thought that was interesting that Special Ops are in there. It suggests that they're not trying to just hold the line or an orderly withdrawal there. They seem to be actually trying to take ground. Now, elsewhere, as I say, up and down the country, a lot of fighting, a lot of claims and counterclaims of ground taken, a lot of statements by Russia saying that certain villages have been taken, but as I say, no real evidence for that. As an example of that, in the northeast, Russian forces are still attacking Kupiansk, both the town itself and also the approaches from the east and the southeast. Ukrainian broadcaster Army Inform countered Russian claims over the weekend that Russian forces had surrounded Ukrainian troops in the Kupiansk-Vuzlovny area, that's to the southeast of Kupiansk, on the eastern side of the Oskil River that's running north-south in this part of the country, makes a very obvious natural obstacle there. Army Inform says that Ukrainian forces still fully control that settlement. Sticking in the northeast, though, 4 people were killed when Russian forces staged a massive drone attack late on Sunday in Kyiv, the local authorities saying there. Kyiv, obviously, Ukraine's second largest city. Elsewhere, the Kramatorsk City Council said yesterday that Russian forces had conducted 2 MLRS strikes, multiple launch rocket system strikes against the residential buildings in the city, killing 3, damaging infrastructure there. They said Russian forces followed up those artillery strikes with a number of drones, Geran 2 drones, Geran being the Russian version of the Iranian Shaheds. Now, drop down to occupied Crimea, and on Friday, a major chemical plant was hit by Ukrainian drones. The head of the Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, better known as Magyar, said yesterday that a number of energy facilities in the occupied territories were blacked out in vicinity of the city of Krasnoperekovsk. That's in the far north of Crimea before we come up across the tributary there into Kherson Oblast. Attacks continued across the whole country. In the north, in Sumy, Kharkiv and Chernihiv. In Chernihiv, the Red Cross says its branch in Koryukivka, that's about 50 k's northeast of Chernihiv city itself, that was hit by drones yesterday. No Red Cross staff or volunteers were hurt, but as they say, that is an action against international humanitarian law and a war crime. Dnipro in the centre of the country was hit, Odessa in the south, elsewhere as well. I simply haven't got time to list everywhere. Just to note, the death toll from Wednesday's cruise missile strikes on those residential buildings in Ternopil, right over in the west of Ukraine, is now risen to 34, with 6 people still missing. In Russia, a Russian opposition outlet Astra said that drones had hit the Shatura state power plant in Shatura, then Moscow Oblast, on Saturday, about 75 kilometres east of the capital city of Moscow. Geolocated footage and imagery published yesterday shows very large plumes of smoke and fires at the plant. Moscow Oblast Governor Andrei Vorobyev acknowledged that drones had hit the plant and that a fire had broken out, but said the power supply was uninterrupted. The Shatura plant supplies electricity and heat to a lot of Moscow region, and it's notable that a number of airports in the area were reportedly closed for some time as a result of those strikes. So a very quick whirlwind tour to bring us up to date, Francis, but that's where we are as of now. Amid the hectic diplomatic whirl around possible peace negotiations, we shouldn't forget that last week's big story centred on the corruption scandal in Ukraine's energy sector. That story hasn't gone away. So to get the latest updates and the status of that story and set it in the wider context of a possible future Ukrainian political landscape after President Zelensky, I spoke to Jakub Parusinski, the director of KI Insights, a politics and security research centre backed by the Kyiv Independent. Here is our conversation. Jakub Parusinski, director of KI Insights, a research centre backed by the Kyiv Independent. You focus on political and security issues in Ukraine. Thank you so much for coming into London today, to the offices here in the Telegraph. Thank you for talking to Ukraine the latest.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here.
Now, we're a bit punch-drunk for news this week. We're recording this on Friday afternoon, so goodness knows what could have happened in the intervening days, but it's coming at us thick and fast at the moment. We're going to start, if we can, with the Energoatom corruption scandal. Obviously the big news in the last 24 hours is the proposed Trump-Heath deal. But on this corruption scandal that sort of set the agenda for the first half of the week, firstly, if we could just start big picture stuff. I mean, how big is this in general? It's been a very big story for those of us that are staring at Ukraine the whole time. But actually, does it have the global significance that's been attached to it?
It's an absolutely huge scandal. It is something that has been the worst crisis for Ukraine since at least 2023. And I think one of the things that's interesting is even the NABU sort of detectives talking to people around town will point out that they did not expect this to be quite so significant.
That's the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine.
Absolutely. And they're the ones who have been driving this. It comes at a time when Ukraine has been beset by a series of crises. I'm not even talking about the latest sort of peace plan related one. There's issues with energy. There's issues with the finances. The economy is not doing great. Ukrzaliznytsia, which is the national train carrier, which is incredibly important for Ukraine, is going through its own troubles with bankruptcy potentially looming down the line. And just in general, I think Ukrainian society is incredibly tired. It's been almost 4 years of full-scale war, and this just hits in a really painful place. So the social reaction is not to be underestimated. This is a huge scandal. It is something that could potentially lead to an institutional crisis as well, because we've seen a lot of people within Parliament, a lot of the MPs saying that, look, something serious needs to happen, whether it's the firing, for example, Andriy Yermak, who's the right hand of Zelensky and arguably the second most important person in the country, firing of various people in the Zelensky administration. And the problem is that essentially Zelensky's grip on parliament is based on a coalition of 229 Slucha Narodu MPs. A majority is 226. And for people who were elected through majoritarian districts, you can't replace them until there are new elections. So this would potentially leave Ukraine in a situation where there is no functioning parliament. So it's very serious. But then this week has provided additional problems on top of it.
Is this because Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts have been successful and are widespread and are taken seriously and are resourced with people and money, or it just happened and it was discovered and it's a sort of same old story?
Well, this is where we get into, I think, a more speculative realm. So the argument that is being, I would say, spread around town is that this is the effect of NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, investigating corruption for 15 months now and really just pulling everything together. I think, by the way, the real reason that we have so much impact of this, because there's been other corruption cases in Ukraine, it happens in every country. This one was accompanied with a sort of almost Netflix-style video series for a couple of days. It was one thing that you could do staying at home in your apartment is watch all of this corruption, very visual, bags of cash and all of that.
Well, as in it was breaking news, it was on
Exactly.
the TVs each night, yeah.
Yeah. Sort of the formatting of it was very engaging, and I think that's something that's worth considering. Now, the question is, NABU has been around for about 10 years. And to say that they have been successful at uncovering and prosecuting corruption in Ukraine would be an overstatement. Their successes are few and far between. It is one of the institutions in Ukraine that is amongst the most distrusted or poorly regarded in terms of its effectiveness. So the fact that they come out with this real banger of an investigation is something that has raised a lot of eyebrows. So people who are supportive of the office of the president, the Zelensky administration, and I would say a fair amount of neutral observers point to the fact that, look, this is coming at a moment when the US turns out really wants to get Ukraine to do something that it doesn't want to do, which is the peace deal. Behind the scenes, there's also discussion about the US does not want Zelensky to run again. That's something that has been communicated both publicly and privately over the past year, and this is another way to pressure him. So there are real questions about to what extent was the NABU investigation done at the behest of Western authorities, presumably the US. It is speculative. I would say the explanation that NABU just really got its act together, and the reason that they say that it broke now is because there was a leak within the investigation. The people that were being investigated were informed about this, and essentially they had to make a decision now or potentially see a lot of their work fall apart. So that explanation, just to be clear, is credible. But the coincidence in terms of the timing, in terms of everything that is happening around it, and the fact that NABU was set up as an instrument for foreign countries to monitor corruption in Ukraine and to influence Ukraine in the right direction is not lost on people. So that's not to say the corruption isn't real, but the timing is very, very suspect.
Now, you say it crosses social, economic, political lines. It's very impactful. The Justice and Energy ministers have both resigned, and Ukrainian Parliament have accepted those resignations. So it's done. They resigned, saying that the honourable thing to do, and they will clear their names from the sidelines. However, they are out. They were sacked Wednesday, I think it was. Yes. So how serious is this for Zelensky? Does the buck stop with the Justice and Energy ministers, or does it keep going?
Definitely not. In general, the perception is that just having the Energy and Justice Minister resign, this is not even close to being enough. It's not just corruption, but it's corruption in a sector that is so essential to the quality of life of Ukrainians at this very moment. So this isn't even close to being enough. There's also been sanctions put on Mindic and a couple of other characters.
So Timur Mindic is the alleged ringleader of this. He's a partner in President Zelensky's Vartel 95 production company. He's a businessman of old. He's gone on the run. I think I saw somewhere a rumour that the deputy head of NABU had tipped him off. He denied that, but Timur Mindic is out of the country, thought to be in Israel, I believe.
Absolutely. So one of the people at SAPO, which is a specialized anti-corruption prosecutor, Andriy Sinyuk, I believe, has already been investigated and dismissed in connection to this leak. So, I mean, all the evidence points to the fact that the leak did happen. In any case, Mindic's disappearance from Ukraine was also incredibly timely. So I think it would be naive to see these events as unconnected. He is on the run. He has been sanctioned. The sanctions are softer than what the National Security and Defense Council typically implements in such cases. One of the issues was that some of the sanctions are for 3 years. Usually it does sanctions for 10 years. There's some other details that are a little bit on the softer side. That also is not seen as enough. There is a large constituency, both within the political elites, but also within broader society, that Zelensky has to essentially sacrifice his top right-hand guy, Andriy Yermak, and that's the only thing short of Zelensky resigning, who some people are calling for, but I think that's still seen as somewhat of a too extreme decision, especially given the full-scale war. Yermak's resignation is still something that is debated.
Yermak was a mayor of the former defense minister, General Alexander Syrsky. I don't think he's directly implicated here, but there's just this feeling of someone's got to carry the can.
Syrsky really is just like catching flack for someone else's mistakes here. I mean, he has his own issues. I mean, it's easy to backseat drive a war. I'm not going to comment on that because I don't feel comfortable enough to do so. But yeah, no, Umerov is definitely up in there. And the other big question is, so NABU has released a bunch of investigations about the energy sector. The very, very widely discussed rumors in Kyiv is that there are further corruption investigations about fortifications, about defense procurement, about potential influence peddling or payoffs to various politicians, and those have not yet come out. We would generally see these as credible, and I say we as in KI Insights. Our assessment is that there are additional investigations. There's a question of why they're not coming out now. One of the reasons is Umerov was traveling around the world, supposedly on various peace discussions, although it looked very much like he just didn't want to be in the country at the moment. So there is a lot of demand for something more to happen. I think the president's team right now is looking at, well, what's something that they can offer that society would accept, but at the same time they still retain their core power base. So basically, what would be enough? And that's a question to be answered.
It's interesting you raise the issue of fortifications there. I mean, the issue of fortifications, it seems to take ages for any building work to take place, and then the images that we saw, President Zelensky touring some of these places, to a trained sort of military engineer, I mean, they were pretty shonky. They didn't look up to the job. They wouldn't put up with much punishment. So there was always this speculation that were they being done on the cheap. So if there's going to be an investigation into that, I mean, that might be the thing that topples the whole handcart over, because I was going to ask, I mean, how many more scandals has President Zelensky got? So if there's another biggie, such as fortifications, then could that topple him? So
that's a very interesting question. If that scandal had come out this week, and we're recording on Friday, so last week for the listeners, if that scandal came out last week, it might have been enough. The big concern is that if a scandal comes out of the same proportion as Energoatom, but which involved the defense, you might get members of the armed forces also involved in protests and so forth. And there we're on a road of escalation. That looks quite terrifying. the last couple of days, Nabu has been quiet, which sort of raises the question of, well, are they being quiet at the behest or at the request of some of the international partners of Ukraine? And would that investigation come out after, Trump's latest supposed deadline passes to sign a peace deal? And is that something that comes out as punishment to Zelensky for not doing what he's told? So if that happens, we're in a more complicated situation. Yes, people will hate the corruption. It is definitely real. But the fact that this is being instrumentalized by a foreign bully is something that will also bring back the feelings that, well, Zelensky stood up to Trump in the Oval Office and paid dearly for it, and Ukraine rallied around him. So it's going to be a very mixed bag of feelings if that happens in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, someone else who's been very quiet is General Zelensky, who's Ukraine's ambassador here in London, widely thought to have political ambition, thought not to be great bedfellows with President Zelensky. In fact, one of the reasons he is here as ambassador is many people thought Zelensky was pushing him from one side from leading the armed forces to sort of shoving him slightly to the side. I mean, it would be a big move to even whisper or allow his name to be used or put anything out there that might try to capitalise on the political difficulties of President Zelensky. But his utter silence, you could read as, well, he's an ambassador for the country, so of course he's not going to comment on that. But equally, a figure of that stature, I would have expected to have heard something somewhere, even if it's just rumours, sources close to, friends suggest that, etc., etc. But he's been very, very quiet.
So, I mean, the fact that he wrote an autobiography about himself while leading the armed forces, it speaks to somebody who has a certain perception of himself and ego and so forth. I mean,
I think Francis is only on his chapter 2 at the moment.
Well, it only gets better. So he does have some kind of public aspirations at the very least, right? But his potential political activity has been the most discreet that I have ever seen in over 15 years of observing Ukrainian politics. And yes, on the one hand, that is the job of an ambassador. It's to speak positively about your country. And if you can't, then at least don't say anything. There is, however, some discussion about potentially him coming back to Kyiv if things go really badly. So one of the scenarios that is being discussed is, would Zaluzhny, as part of a government of national unity, as a response to the corruption scandals and to the American pressure, be something that would help the Ukrainian people rally around, right? And I think the answer is probably yes. It is a bit of a poisoned chalice if he wants to become prime minister or president. Coming into the middle of this really difficult situation might not do him any favors, but that is hanging in the air.
Just before we move away from the direct sort of corruption issue here, just one final question for you. A lot of external aid, military equipment, humanitarian support, but also cash has been flowing into Ukraine. Do you think this scandal makes it any easier for external backers of Ukraine to support in pure cash terms? Does this make them think Nabu and Sapo are all over this? They will make sure it goes to the right places? Or do you think this will make external supporters reluctant to keep funneling cash?
I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's a disaster for Ukraine from a fundraising perspective and being able to convince people to continue supporting. It is a huge gift to Russia and all these anti-Ukraine forces. That being said, I think generally the perception from most of the European countries, at the very least, is that, look, this isn't a question of we're supporting Ukraine because the country's perfect. There's a real strategic, military, geopolitical game happening here. It's terrible that bad actors have abused this, but ultimately the number one priority is a relatively stable and strong Ukraine that can, one, hold back Russia, and two, also not generate additional chaos and additional problems for Europe through institutional degradation or disintegration, God forbid. So I think that it's still going to continue, but no, it's very bad.
Now, we were chatting earlier on about the situation that's broken in the last couple of days, this supposed peace plan that the US have put together with Russia, although Russia's been very quiet about it.
They haven't said they support it.
Well, the foreign ministry has said they can't comment on because they've not seen it. Well, apparently you co-authored it. But anyway, so it seems to have taken everybody by surprise. But if this somehow ends with a fudgy, nasty, negotiated peace. There will be many people who are extremely unhappy with that because there's a lot in that proposed plan that is not favourable to Ukraine. We know that Donald Trump detests President Zelensky because Zelensky wouldn't find/invent dirt on Hunter Biden when Trump wanted it for the 2016 election. So he's always harboured that grudge. They've never got on. I've asked many Ukrainian officials, is President Zelensky the impediment here? And it's time for him to take one for the team, get a deal over the line, draw the sting out of the argument, move to the right, and et cetera, et cetera. Is that a realistic scenario? Do you think, does he want to stand for a second term after the end of, whenever this war ends? I mean, he must be absolutely exhausted, isn't he?
Yeah, well, that's a difficult question. I would say as of 2 weeks ago, yes, Zelensky still wanted to have a second term. We saw a lot of activity preparing elections and making sure that he could run. If needed be, defeating Zelensky, which despite the polls that favor Zelensky, I wouldn't say that it was a foregone conclusion that he would win. Zelensky is an incredibly talented political operator. He's a great communicator. He has incredible charisma. And Zelensky, even though he's widely admired by the Ukrainian population, Zelensky gets attacked and hit publicly every single day. I mean, he deals with scandals and crises for breakfast. Zelensky has had a relatively relaxed time in London. I think if he got into the dirt and muck that would be a political election in Ukraine right now, that would look quite different. That being said, I would speculate that Zelensky still would prefer a second term. And by the way, it's worth mentioning that Russia has repeatedly insisted that it's not Zelensky that they negotiate with, it's instead the Rada, because they see Zelensky as illegitimate. So there's a question, could Zelensky even do that if it did come to a deal? But I think that narrative is deeply unsatisfying for him. I mean, he's the one who saved Ukraine by staying in Kyiv, by rallying society, rallying the military to withstand Russia in 22. And that narrative needs to go somewhere, whether it's bringing Ukraine into the European Union. He would have preferred NATO, I'm sure. But, that's an alternative. Something needs to happen there. And I think he'll still try for that, although it is becoming a more difficult case by the day. That being said, I think it's worth noting that, yes, Trump is deeply frustrated with Zelensky because from his perspective, he wants to deal with Russia, he wants leverage against China, he wants all of these global plans. And there's this guy in Ukraine who keeps getting in the way. But also, Zelensky is the only known quantity that has withstood maximum pressure from the US and Russia at the same time, basically, in the interests of the Ukrainian nation. And that's something that Zelensky can lean on. Because whether it was in the Oval Office, whether it's the full-scale invasion by Russia, Zelensky has stuck to his guns, has stuck to maybe an overly optimistic position of where Ukraine will end the war. But he's held back from agreeing to any bad deal in the past. And I think that's where he's going to try to rally support.
As I said, we're recording this on Friday afternoon. We've had a little time now to look at this proposed deal in some detail. So there's no need for hot takes. But what leapt out for you?
So generally speaking, it's not a good signal when people are trying to get you to sign a deal very, very quickly. That generally doesn't tell you that the deal is very favorable to you. There's obviously a huge amount of pressure. At the very best, the corruption investigations are being instrumentalized. The fact that Zelensky's under pressure is being leveraged by the US. At the worst, as I mentioned, there's a lot of coincidences which raise eyebrows about just how much that those two things are happening in parallel. But when it comes to the deal itself, it seems to be a rehash from the April deal that the U.S. put on the table. I think back then it was de jure recognition of Crimea and Donbass. Now it's de facto. So there's a little bit of changes here, but it seems like the Americans have rehashed an old deal, tried to force it through everyone before they can get their wits about them, and somehow hope for this to work out. To paraphrase the Churchill quote, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else a couple of times, right? So it is quite strange, but it all feels quite flimsy and chaotic, at least at this moment.
Well, a couple of things that stuck out for me, and you talk about the form of it. I thought that was interesting. So there's language in there. It uses the term Nazi. So it says Ukraine must refuse to ever embrace Nazi ideology or something like that. And it's just complete hogwash because they'd never sign up for that because that accepts that they had Nazi ideology. And that's obviously put in there by Russia. The Americans wouldn't have come up with terminology like that. And I wonder if they've put it in there to be so over the top that they can trade it. that they can ditch those. Now, I'm told by anyone I ask that is very unlike the Russian negotiating position, which is to demand the maximum, not take a step backwards, but, hey, maybe they're being smart about this. And the other bit was the whole no diplomatic flights from other countries allowed to go into Ukraine. Again, I mean, just nonsense for start. Okay, well, I'll get the train then, or I'll drive. For all Russia's silence in the last 24 hours, I wonder are they prepared to trade, do you think? Am I being too Machiavellian about this?
No, I don't think you're being too Machiavellian at all. If anything, I'd say too generous in terms of how sophisticated the strategy is. It feels like this has Steve Witkoff's trademark bumbling approach to diplomacy written all over it. As one sort of veteran political leader in Ukraine characterized this, there's things in there that are bad for Ukraine. There's things in there that are pretty decent. And then there's a whole bunch of things which are completely meaningless. And it's very slapdash in the way that it's put together. There's things that are not even technically feasible. There's things that are completely open to interpretation. If you look at, for example, this idea that Ukraine will implement EU standards when it comes to minorities and languages. Implementation of EU standards varies quite a lot. Is that going to be implementation of democracy standards by Hungary, right? Well, that means Ukraine can do anything at all. Other things are completely out of their purview and reach. I mean, the EU accepts Ukraine. Well, that isn't the Americans' sort of right to decide that. There is vague stuff like the US will receive compensation. I mean, clearly that's the main motive in half the things that the Trump administration does. But, yeah.
And it's also not been staffed properly. It's not had somebody who knows how to negotiate, read this in, because there's reference in there to Ukraine will get reliable security guarantees. I mean, you don't need to use the word reliable in there. You either have a security guarantee or you don't. So don't put the word reliable in the document. So if you've got a clause in there that talks about reliable security guarantees, does that mean every other clause is not reliable if it doesn't have the word reliable? I mean, it's just been poorly written. It's
Absolutely.
It's a sort of best guess by...
I mean, frankly, ChatGPT would have done a much better job of putting this document together. But my sense of it is that this is the Americans. It's Steve Witkoff. It's a couple of other players just throwing something out there, seeing what sticks, and basically initiating the process. So I do think the coming week we'll see quite a bit of a negotiation. We already see European alternatives. I'm sure Russia will come out with a position. China, by the way, I imagine would also have its opinion on these matters. So we're going to see quite a fervor of activity, but will that result in anything? I mean, it doesn't feel like something has changed, although at this point nobody really knows.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, Jakub Parusinski, thank you so much for talking to Ukraine the latest.
Thank you so much.
Let's go to our final thoughts now then. Dom, where do you want to leave listeners today?
A bit left field, if I may, but I had a very nice email from a retired US Air Force full bird colonel. Won't name the individual, but thank you very much for writing in, with an idea how to support the Ukrainian military. He says retired US military members can't work directly for Ukraine's MOD due to the US Constitution's emoluments clause, something I'm completely unaware of. So please do educate me. However, the individual says that people could volunteer to provide staff functions through a non-governmental organisation, for example, attached to the Ukrainian military. That may get round the emoluments clause barrier. So my question is, does such an arrangement already exist? And if not, are there any retired senior staffers up for trying to get such a scheme off the ground? The individual who wrote to us suggested each post could be covered by, or each job could be covered by, 2 retired officers who work, let's say, 3 months at a time, then swap over. There's loads of hurdles, not least the language, but I thought that was quite interesting. And thank you to the individual for sending that in. And I welcome any thoughts you had on the subject.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. A momentous day, everybody. Do stick with us on the Telegraph website, where we've got our Ukraine live blog running over the course of the day, featuring insights from regulars on this podcast, like James Rothwell, Joe Barnes and Roland Oliphant. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow, unless we feel there is a need to do a bonus episode given events. Entirely possible this week. Things are changing hour by hour. So stay tuned. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.